in your textbook. See the images of this. So we're looking at what? Anterior meaning what? Which side? So if you go, everybody get back into anatomical position here. So that we know which side is anterior. So when we're going like this, remember, anatomical position is what? Where are the eyes?
Forward.
Forward. Feet? Forward. Palms are forward, right. So that tells us that in anatomical position, the anterior would be your palm side. Posterior is what? Backside. So we're going to look at this. So we know that this smaller bone by the pinky would be which one? There's your ulnar bone. You guys got that. Then, Steve, wrist bones. That was on your quiz. These are the carpals. Exactly. Well, we're going to get to those next. Right. Now this is new. So there's a term that's referred to as meta. If something is meta, that means it is after or beyond. So if we talk about something that is after, ask us if you're looking at the, yes. One order of phalanges, please. So you just don't think about it. You think, all right, that is after the carpal bones. We're going to refer to that as metacarpals. See how helpful it is to understand what this word means? So if something is beyond the carpals, we call those metacarpals. And below that, so these, if you will, your metacarpals, point to your metacarpals. This is your palm of your hand. These bones are your metacarpals. So we don't think about the palm of our hand as having bones, right? You just don't think about it. You think, all right, I got bones there, but the palm, for some reason, you just don't think about having bones there for whatever, I don't know why. But you do. Those are your metacarpals. And you've got how many of them? 5. Okay. Then the fingers are referred to as phalanges. Or what do they call them in Spanish? Phalanges. Right? Similar root word.
That sounds like a Spanish deal.
Yes. One order of phalanges, please. With a little salsa on the side, right?
I know.
Right. Now, when we look at these, we have these phalanges, but sometimes if we're going to describe them, we need to have more information, because if we just say, well, there were some stiffness in the phalanges, that doesn't tell us enough. We need more information about that. We need to understand it. So there's our metacarpals. So we're going to call these, the first ones in green here, a proximal phalanx, or to refer to which phalange we're talking about. So the proximal means what?
It's closest towards.
Closest to closer in towards the body. So that's the one you would come to first.
What does this thread open?
Phalanx. Phalanx.
Michael, this is very expensive, right?
So if this one's the proximal one, Zarya, what would we call this one? Absolutely perfect. Yeah. So there's your distal one. Now that works, except, well, in the thumb at least. But what about here? We've got 3. So, so we would call the green ones here, these are the proximal ones. But Cliff, what do you think we would call the red ones here? And you say, well, if that one's the proximal one and that one's the distal one, you would say that's the yes. Yeah, but you would. What happened? Yep, let me go back to this. I think we missed something here.
Something that smells rotten, no?
Yeah. So there's middle, proximal.
Your sausage, I think it is.
Proximal. We'll call that the middle one. Right? Huh? And then there's the distal one. So that's how we would describe which one. Yeah. We know proximal, we know distal, so this one would just be in the middle. So if you look at your fingers for a second, you can see these are the joints, and you can see on your fingers, right? Just take a look at your fingers right here, and you see that you have down here, there's your proximal one, there's the one in the middle, and there's the distal one. Right? Well, most people have never looked at their hands in that way to try to describe it. Okay?
We don't have that many thumbs.
You just don't. I mean, it's just. It looks like there ought to be 3, but there's not. There's just a proximal and a distal. But you do have this other joint here, but this is considered a metacarpal. So if you're looking at the thumb, you say there's actually a bone right here that is part of the palm, really. So that's why we call it a metacarpal. So you really do have, in essence, 3 on the thumb, but the one is just called the metacarpal.
What was the meaning for carpal?
Carpal, just wrist.
So then what's the carpal bone?
Well, the carpal bones are your wrist bones. All these little guys right here. And we'll name those and we'll talk about those.
Okay, so carpal is wrist and carpal bones is wrist bones.
Yes. So there's your carpals, or carpal bones, are these. There's 8 of those. So people who have carpal tunnel issues, it's because of this area right here on the wrist. And that's where they'll talk to you about it. Or they'll say, oh, I'm having issues with my wrist. They are not able to do certain things that they used to do because of that. Now, do you think you can help people with that?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely can.
There's muscle in there. Like Oscar said when they did massages.
Yeah.
So it felt so young.
Yeah. Now, one other thing that we want to do is sometimes we want to be a little more specific, because we could say, well, there's a middle phalanx, but we have to say, well, of what? How do we identify which one it is? So we're going to number the fingers themselves. We're going to say the thumb is 1. The index finger is 2. The middle finger is 3. The ring finger is 4. And the little pinky is 5. So that can help us to describe it where we're working. See, now we have all the information to describe anything about the hand. Right? We can name which digit we're working on, and which joint or which phalanx we're looking at, or part of the hand. You see, that tells us, and then we can describe that or document that into our work and say it was their third middle phalanx that had their issue, something, or it could be the joint between the distal and middle, or between the proximal and the middle. You see, so if we're talking about a stiffness in a joint, you can say which one it is and describe it and document it. Okay. Now on to Ida's favorite thing, the feet.
Oh. My favorite.
Not your favorite. Okay. So feet are amazing because so many people have issues with their feet. They will come to you and say, I don't know, can you just work on my feet? For people who love working on feet, does anybody love working on feet?
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Feet. You can spend your whole career just working on feet. Really?
You can.
It's called what? Reflexology. Reflexology is something, you'll get a taste of it in massage school, but if you want advanced training, there's an amazing advanced training an hour from here in St. Petersburg.
Oh, yeah.
Check it out. If you look online, this is called...
You're running out of markers.
I do. Can you toss this in the trash, please?
There it is. Oh, my.
Got another one. If you look up reflexology in St. Petersburg, you will find, and the name is something like the International School of Reflexology or something like that. And they are a world-class, like the best. People come from all over the world to go up to the school to learn reflexology. The founder of reflexology, I forget if it's a son or daughter, anyway, runs the institute up there. Amazing. So if you're interested in working on feet...
Does it work? Yeah.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
I love doing reflexology.
Reflexology.
You can do some amazing things, and there's great images. Go online, say I want images for reflexology. You'll find charts of the bottom of the foot, and yeah, great stuff. So the bones, just like we have carpals in the wrist, we have tarsals in the feet. This is on page 211 in your book, if you want to follow along. So tarsals are in the feet. What do you think? Huh?
216.
16?
The better.
Better image? Okay. Yeah. It is. Yep. That's a little more detail than probably we'll get into. But so if you say the tarsals are just like the carpals, they're the bones, the little bones of the foot, then what would be beyond or after the tarsals?
Metatarsals.
Yes, absolutely right. See, now you guys got it. So there's your metatarsals. Then below that, guess what these are called, Lily?
Those are phalanges.
Yes, they are, just like the hands. So you have phalanges with that too. Now, we also want to make sure that we understand what is called the dorsal versus the plantar surface. So with this, your plantar surface is actually the bottom. So if you put your hand on the bottom of your foot, this is the plantar surface. So some people have tightness on the plantar surface of their foot, and when they get out of bed in the morning, does anybody know somebody where they'll say, oh, and it'll be stiff and tight. And they'll come to you and they'll talk about that, where they say, first thing in the morning when I step out of bed, wow, that's some really tight, they'll feel that tightness, and they call that plantar fasciitis. Who's heard of that one before?
Yes.
That's which is inflammation on the bottom of the foot with the connective tissue. We'll get into that. Then there's the dorsal surface. The dorsal, any fishermen out there? People who go fishing? What do they call the fin on the back of a fish? Dorsal fin. Right? So the dorsal surface of the foot is going to be the top. Right here. So there's your top. So if we're trying to describe where the issue is, we would say it's either on the bottom, plantar surface, or the dorsal, the top surface of the foot. And now we're able to describe where their issue is. Does it have to do with the tarsals, the metatarsals, or the phalanges? And just like this, you'll see that there's a proximal and a distal on those as well.
And there's a few medial.
There's a few middle ones in there too. Yeah, so when we get a little closer in there, we'll see there's your metatarsals, there's your proximal phalanx, your distal, and there, proximal, we have a middle and a distal as well. So that helps us to describe it. Now, do you think that we have numbering system on the feet as well?
Yes.
Ida, where do you think number 1 is going to be?
I want to say the big toe.
Yes, well done. So there's the big toe is going to be number 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be the little toe. Yeah.
I'll just take myself. I'll slide my arms
There you go. You know, if that's an easy way to remember it, say right on. That's you're number 1. Right? Thumbs up or toes up. You know, because sometimes you have to think about, Cliff, you know, like how do you remember that? How do you make sense out of that? Okay? So, right on.
If you break any of your toes, it's supposed to hurt your balance.
It's gonna it can throw that off, sure, because you have to compensate for it. And there's some people who say your feet are the foundation for the entire structure of the body. And if your feet are off in some way, if you broke a toe, if you had an issue with any of the joints in the toe, in the foot, and you're compensating it, how many of you have ever seen people that kind of walk like this?
No.
Or just stand like this? They just stand. Or they'll lean like this, right? Because there's some issue with their foot or their hip. And they're trying to compensate for it. Pay attention. You guys like watching people? Anybody do people watching?
Yes.
People watching. You will never watch people the same way after you're done with massage school. Because you're going to start looking at them, and you're looking at their posture, and you want to start looking at it through the eyes of the massage therapist, because then you can start to understand how you can help them and why they're unconsciously compensating for issues in their body that they don't even realize it. If you say, how do you stand? I have pretty good posture. And they will. They'll just stand there just like this. See them. That's just what they do. Right? Foot off the ground, hip raised, and you say, why are they doing it?
Because they have a shorter leg.
There's some issue that's going on that they're compensating for.
My daughter,
And they don't even realize it.
I watch people's feet when they walk. I have a bad habit of that. I can see the elbows down, and you can tell that I walk funny because I have one hand.
All right, moving on. So what are we looking at here? The bottom of the skull. So we're looking from the bottom up. So a new term here. This we know, this bone on the back of the head is called the what, Mercedes? The back of the head, this bone, occiput. Yes. So these little bumps right here are called the occipital condyles. Those are going to be attachment points coming up for a muscle. You'll see this in the text on 167.
68.
Or 168. Is it the wrong page? You have to change that. Oh, you're right. I gotta change that.
Those are attachment points, you said?
Yeah. These will be attachment points. So usually at the beginning of the lecture, we'll introduce some landmarks in the body that may be for that muscle of the day or maybe for muscles that are coming on, just to introduce it to it. So that's now some other landmarks here. So what are we looking at here? Which three bones are we working with? Steve.
The femur.
Is which one?
The top bone.
Yes. And then we have these two.
Which is tibia. Tibia is the lateral.
Which one is the lateral?
I think it's
The one on the left.
Phone a friend.
which one is
The first one, let's see it. This is the posterior view. Yes, this is the posterior view.
Yes.
right.
How do we know it's posterior view?
The patella is not showing.
You're right. We don't see a patella or a kneecap on there. So we know we're looking at it from the back. So this is our lateral condyle of the femur. Now how do we know it's lateral? Because this bone is your what? Sorry.
That's a fibia.
How do we know that's lateral? Remember the word, it ends in LA for lateral. And we know that we have a little fib. Right? That's the easy way to remember it. So that whenever you look at that, you say, all right, I know we have a big bone, we have a little bone. The little bone is your little fib, law meaning lateral. So it's just a nice, easy way to remember where you're looking at. And we know that we're looking at it from the back, posterior. Because as Ida pointed out, we don't see a patella or a kneecap on there. So we know we're looking at it from the back.
How do we know which leg that is now?
Well,
The left leg.
we have to think about it. You say, okay, is it going to be the right leg? Well, the right leg would have the lateral fibula on this side. So because we're looking at it from the back, so we're looking at it from the posterior side, lateral fibula, so that tells us we're looking at a right leg. Yeah. Right
I don't know why it looks like.
lower extremity. So if we would say that, we would say it's looking at the right lower extremity from the posterior side. Okay. So sometimes you have to deconstruct it and figure out what are we looking at here. And then you would say, all right, now it makes sense. We know that this side is lateral, because there's our fibula. So this is called the condyle of the femur, because we already know this is a femur. All right? So if that's the femur, and that's the lateral condyle, Cliff, what's this other side going to be called? If that's the lateral condyle of the femur, that's got to be the, take a guess. Phone a friend. Nudge a friend.
Lateral and most of that.
Oh.
Close. Medial. Right? Because lateral lateral is talking about what on the outside of the body. Medial would be towards the midline. Yeah. So that's going to be your medial condyle of that. So this, Lily, would be, we're referring to which bone here?
Tibia.
Tibia. So we would call that the what?
Tibial condyle. Lateral condyle.
Yeah, lateral condyle of the tibia. And if that's true, then Ida, what would we call the other side? It would have to be the...
That's the medial condyle.
Exactly. That's where these two bones come together and articulate. Now, we've just flipped it. Okay. Because now, what are we looking at? We were looking at a right. Now, what are we looking at?
Is this like lateral view? Yeah. This is like not.
What are we looking at now? We have which bones are we looking at now?
No. Is that the humerus?
Oh, this is the.
Yeah.
This is the elbow, the olecranon.
No idea.
No idea.
Yeah, we all messed up.
If you look on page 201, you will see, now we just shifted. So now when we look at these, this is the look at that. Two terms that we're going to talk about next. One is called the capitulum, and the other one is called the trochlea. And if you look in your book on 201, you will see yeah, they do.
The 200.
Huh?
The 200.
Or do they have it on 200 as well?
Capitulum.
Yeah, that might be an easier one to look at. I like that even better. It's on 201 as well, but this is a close-up of this. So when we look at this, we say, all right, what are we looking at here? So we are looking at the arm, the upper extremity. So this is anterior. How do we know it's anterior? Well, it says it at the bottom of the page. This is anterior on the left, posterior on the right. So anterior, we're looking at that, and we know that we're looking anterior because we're not seeing what? What's on the back? Yeah, which is also known as the olecranon process, right? So it tells us kind of the direction that we're looking at. We're looking anteriorly for this. as well as on this side. So if you were going to describe this anatomically, one way that you could do it is to say that it was the lateral portion. So if we're looking at it like this, you would say this is lateral. Of the distal articulation. Of the humerus. So there's our humerus. And so just like in the quiz, we would say this is the distal articulation. Articulation means what? It's when these two bones come together of the humerus. So that would be considered the condition. The trochlea then would be considered what? How do you define that? Steve?
The medial portion.
Uh-huh. So that's the medial portion of the distal articulation of the humerus. So if you're looking at this picture on 200, and you imagine that that is your right anterior extremity, then you'll see that's why this is a little backwards coming to that. But you'll see that the trochlea is on the medial side and the capitulum is on the lateral side. If we flip that around, then you would see that's where your olecranon process is. So you see the difference between those two? Now you're looking at olecranon process, you're not looking at a capitulum or a trochlea. You got that? Difference between that and that. Same part of the body, just anterior versus posterior. I know you know this one. Now we know that we're looking at it from the posterior side. We have this little line on the posterior side. We were just talking about that before class. Yes. So that is your spiral groove of the humerus. And that is coming right there by your radius. And this is just a review of that's which nerve that comes on there, Mercedes? Radial. Yeah. There's your radial nerve. Comes down from your neck. So a lot of clients will come to you because they have issues with their neck. That can sometimes be the nerve that's associated with that. Okay. Really quick. I'm just going to review this. This is your what, Steve? Yeah.
Next day.
You got that. So if that's your radial tuberosity, Zaria, what is the other one?
Your ulnar.
Right, because you recognize this. coming under here. So there's your ulnar tuberosity. And Cliff, this little portion coming right up, which is going to be important for today's muscle, is called the coronoid process. Close. So it sounds like the coracoid, but it's the coronoid process, just like this crown. When you think of the crown coronoid because it's kind of coming up into this. And then there's your olecranon process, which is what kind of a joint? That's your hinge joint. Right. Okay. So your elbow joint, also known as your humeral ulnar joint, that's review, okay, which is a hinge joint. Does flexion and extension. And then this is your radial ulnar joint, which does what?
Supination.
Rotation, right. That's your pivot. That's going to be your supination and pronation. Okay. Now on to our muscle of the day. Brachialis, page 132 in your trail guide. So brachialis, just to introduce it, this one is deep to the biceps brachii. So what you're seeing here, here's the long head and the short head. And now we're just going to cut it away here, and we're going to say it is deep to that. Now we understand what deep is, meaning closer into the bones. And it only crosses one joint. So because it only crosses one joint, that means it's only going to affect one joint as far as the action of it. So that's significant to understand that. Now it tells us as well, because we know of the location of it, if it's deep to biceps brachii, we're saying that muscle is where? Anterior or posterior? Anterior, right? So it is anterior. You're in anatomical position, and there's your biceps. This one is just deep to it, so it's also anterior. So that's going to tell us a little bit about the action of it as well. So understanding location tells us. So this is the red muscle here, just deep to biceps brachii. So the joint that it crosses is the humeral ulnar joint. Where's that? There's our humerus, there's our ulnar. So you know that that's the joint that's going to affect as far as the action. So based on that, what do you think the action is going to be, Lily?
Coming down over here, gonna help with pronation.
Because of where it is, remember, anytime a muscle is anterior, it's going to be involved with flexion. Okay? So if you get that into your mind, go back and review the muscle sheet. And you'll see anterior muscles above the knee will do flexion. So deep to biceps brachii we talked about, attaches to the humerus and the ulna. I'm going to go through these a little quick. It only crosses one joint, and that's the elbow. Or humeral ulnar joint. And that's flexion of the toes. It is considered strong from any position on the radius. It is considered, new term here, the prime mover in elbow flexion. What does that mean? Prime mover.
So you said it's considered what? Strongest?
Yeah. So a prime mover is the one that initiates movement during activity. A lot of times in the body, there will be multiple muscles that are working together to do some action. But the one that is considered the prime mover is the one that initiates it. for the other ones. So this is considered the prime mover. It is an agonist in elbow flexion. So what the heck does that mean? Agonist. So if it's an agonist, if you look in your book, on page 11 in your trail guide, at the bottom of page 11, in the little box, blue box at the bottom, sorry, if you would read the first 3 or 4 lines on that, I want you to highlight this, and these are definitions that are going to help you when we're talking about prime movers, agonists, synergists, and all these other. You want to understand these as definitions. Bottom of page 11, the first 4 lines.
In order for specific movement to occur, muscles have to play a particular role. A muscle or group of muscles that carry out an action is called the agonist. While a muscle that supports the agonist is called synergist. A muscle that has an opposite action of the agonist is called an antagonist.
Good, thank you. So all the muscles that are working together in elbow flexion, they're called the agonist. But then there's a prime mover, primary one that initiates the action. So it is part of the ones that are involved with elbow flexion. It is considered the prime mover. In other words, it initiates the action. So when you're doing a movement, sometimes there's 3 or 4 or 5 muscles that are working together to help you do that movement. There's a prime mover, primary, meaning that's going to have the foundation for the movement that initiates it. But then there's others that are working together. Okay? So those are some key definition terms that we're going to use throughout the whole class. So it assists in elbow flexion by the synergists, including biceps brachii. So the biceps brachii that we learned last time is considered a synergist. In other words, it's working together to also do flexion of the elbow. And that's the muscle in green that we learned last time with their short head and our long head. Okay. So you see how them being in the same location would make sense that they would be working together to flex the elbow. So that's why it's important to understand the terms prime mover, agonist, synergist. So what does it do? So it's involved with elbow flexion. So that's going to be this move. If we're in anatomical position and we flex, therefore we're doing what? Ida. Demonstrate flexion of the elbow. If you're in anatomical position, yes. Flexion is moving in the sagittal plane, if you will, out of anatomical position. Anytime so you start here. If you flex it, you're moving in the sagittal plane. That's flexion. Where does it begin? Origin. Distal half. Distal half. What does that mean? Well, if you say, well, if you cut the bone in half, not that you would, but if you were going to, and you would say, well, there would be we have a proximal half and we have a distal half. Okay, you get that. So if we're saying it begins at the distal half of the anterior shaft. Anterior means what? Towards the front. So that's telling you where it is. On the anterior side, it attaches on the distal half. Of what bone? Of the humerus. Then, where does it insert? So there's our proximal attachment or origin. And then insertion. Where does it go? So it's inserting here on the tuberosity and the coronoid process of the ulna. So that's why we had to learn what those were. So we can describe it. So that's our brachialis. And that's what it looks like underneath or deep to the biceps brachii. Now sometimes, yes, questions.
So the muscle that we were just watching was underneath the brachii.
Deep to the biceps brachii. Yeah. So if you look, sometimes it's nice to do this. I like to do this. Mercedes. If you read on your trail guide on 132, at the bottom of the page, usually someplace around the muscle, get more rest. Or maybe you didn't sleep well last night. But there's a blue box at the bottom of page 132. If you would read that for us.
When do you use your brachialis? Bringing food from the plate to your mouth, picking up a load of anatomy books, or carrying a baby cart?
Yeah. So think about this. With every muscle, there's one of these, and it's helpful to understand when you're using these. What do you do? So if you were going to pick something up to eat it, what is that? That's flexion, right? You're going to do that action. So why is that helpful? It's helpful to understand it because if your client comes to you and they say, I'm having problems doing some action. What are you having problems doing? Well, I'm having problems lifting up stuff. Or, if I'm going to eating or whatever it is, maybe they'll say that. Okay, so that can tell you exactly which muscle it is that you want to focus on during the session. If you understand what it is that they're having trouble doing. Helpful. So, shifting gears. We've got 10 more minutes left to get through these. There are two types of glands. There are those that go into the blood, and then there are those that go everywhere else. And this is on page 84 in your text. Follow along. So if it goes into the blood, those are endocrine glands. Most of the time, they're going to be releasing things like hormones into your blood. If they're going anyplace else, those are exocrine. Think about excreting things. Such as what? So we're going to go into the endocrine system a little bit. So what does it do? Most of the time it's secreting hormones into the blood. Things like what? What are we looking at here? Anybody recognize that? That's actually your thyroid, which is right here in the throat. Some people that you'll work on will have thyroid issues. In other words, they're having to take medication because their thyroid is not working properly. Does anybody know somebody who might be dealing with that? Yeah, it's very common. Not there. Exocrine glands, what do? They secrete all sorts of substances onto free surfaces through ducts. Good definition of that. Free surfaces, what the heck does that mean? Think of your skin as like a free surface. It might secrete a substance like what? Sweat onto a free surface. Might secrete earwax onto a surface of your ear. You see how that's different than secreting a hormone into your bloodstream. Totally different type. So it's often through ducts, like what? So somebody had said before, tear ducts, sweat. Not really sweat ducts, but or it could go directly onto the skin, more like we would call those sweat glands, not sweat ducts. So examples of exocrine glands or what they're secreting: sweat, mucus, saliva, digestive juices, semen is even called that, or mother's milk. That's being excreted from the body. Oh, and as I mentioned before, earwax as well. So digestive juices, that's what's going to help break down your food when you've eaten it. Saliva is also in the mouth. It's going to be breaking down food. Mucus could be in the nose, could be in the throat. Sweat anywhere on the body. As we get into the summer season, it's okay if you sweat. Sweat is doing what? Yeah, it's bringing your body back into homeostasis, which is that relatively constant thing when you get too hot. Right? So it's actually a good thing that works for you. Directional terms I'm just going to skim right through because we've worked with those. Glands we talked about. Now this is the section that we did not cover that was on your test. The urinary system. So structures of the urinary system. What is it made of? You have your kidneys. Kidneys are where? Back of your lower back. Your bladder, which is why you have to get up in the middle of class because you're drinking too much. Which is no such thing as drinking too much. Well, there is actually. It depends. Yeah. So then what do you have? You have the ureters. Now we know what the ureters are. What are the ureters? It was on your quiz. Some of you actually got that right. The question was, what duct carries urine to the urinary bladder? It's the ureters. And then there's the urethra, which allows it to come out of the body.
What is the urethra, please? Can you show it?
Ureters. So that's
the
these.
urethra, the bottom one.
Oh, urethra. That's right here at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's what allows it to come out of the body. And there's your bladder in there. And people can always feel, they have this sense of their bladder is expanding. So if you gotta go, you gotta go. One of the things that you'll learn when you're doing massage is how to get that balance between having enough fluids and not having to use or go to the restroom when you're doing a 1 hour massage, right? For an hour and a half. But sometimes, when I do longer sessions, an hour and a half or 2 hours, most of the time in the middle, I will sometimes ask my client or check in with them and say, do you need to use the restroom? Now sometimes into your blood might secrete a substance like what? Sweat onto a freezer. As we get into the summer season, It's okay if you sweating. Things could be in the throat, sweat anywhere on the body. As we get into the summer season, which is no such thing as drinking too much. Well, there is actually. It depends. Duct carries urine to the urinary bladder. It's the ureters. And then there's the urethra, which allows it to come out of the body.
What is the urethra, please? Can you show it?
Ureters. So that's these.
The bottom one.
Oh, urethra. That's right here at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's what allows it to come out of the body. And there's your bladder in there. And people can always feel, they have this sense of their bladder is expanding. So if you gotta go, you gotta go. One of the things that you'll learn when you're doing massage is how to get that balance between having enough fluids and not having to use or go to the restroom when you're doing a 1 hour massage, right? Or an hour and a half. But sometimes, when I do longer sessions, an hour and a half or 2 hours, if we're looking at it from the side, because there's your spinal cord. So you just get a sense of how everything is in line, right? Now, other term. Oops. Let me go back one. So your gonads produce gametes. Interesting concept, right? So what are the gametes? These are the sperm for males, or oocytes is considered the egg of the female. So you could say the gonads produce the gametes. It's another easy way of describing it. We're about out of time here. All right. Associated organs that transport and store the gametes. That's okay. We're going to have to end right there. We'll get further into the reproductive system next time. So we'll end with there. Next time, since we don't have a quiz, we'll be able to get through a lot more of this.
This is the function of the reproduction.
Yeah, then we'll get into the functions. Yeah. So
The end.